Hi everyone and welcome back to Scale Studio. This is the third video in which Panzermeister36 and I will be building, painting, and weathering our StuGs. Before we get started, let me remind you guys to vote for the next model on a free poll that I'm hosting on my Patreon page. Link will be in the description and in comments. It takes 2 minutes, is totally free, and will help me know what you guys want to see next. Also, feel free to check out the page, as it works sort of like a magazine subscription with frequent posts from my workbench. Also, there are other great perks that you guys can unlock by selecting a tier. But without further ado, let's get the show on the road. So I'm going to start by just taking off the tracks and road wheels and tools so we don't have to weather around them in the upcoming steps. So first up, since we've already applied a filter, we're going to apply a wash. This should be second step in any weathering process. And yes, I consider it weathering because it's also wearing down on the model a little bit. But basically just apply it around all cracks and crevices to emphasize them and make them pop. Then, once you're done, you'll just take some enamel thinner, because I did decide to use an enamel paint this time, not oil, and clean up the excess. The benefit to having oil over enamel is that you can blend oil paints out. With enamel, it's all or nothing. You either remove them all or you leave it all. So that is a benefit that I can see, but I wanted to try something new with this model, so I went for the enamel paint. Make sure you're not using Vallejo paints with this, because the enamel thinner and enamel wash will eat right through them. This is a problem I had on the Tiger, which is why I used oil paints, because they're a little gentler. Usually I use a fine tip brush because of the precision it brings, but for larger areas like this, I like to wet it down and then tap the brush multiple times to model the appearance. And as you can see, all you do is you take your brush with not completely loaded down with enamel thinner, but enough to actually make the enamel paint react to it, and move around each detail where there's too much and only remove the excess. One thing I see that I did for the Tiger is I removed all of it, and that's something you don't want to do. Make sure to remove only the excess and leave some behind. If the transitions look a little too sharp and you don't like that, use a cotton swab to blend those out. It actually helps a lot. One big no-no with washes is do not use acrylic paint. Acrylic paint dries hard and it dries near permanently. Oil paints and enamel paints both dry very slowly, or set up very slowly. They don't dry permanently for either a couple hours or a couple days, so you have plenty of time to work on it. Of course, don't leave it for a week and come back, because then you won't be able to remove anything and it's going to be super frustrating. But bottom line, do not use acrylic paints. For the side of the model here, I wanted to do a little bit of streaking, and I think it went okay. I didn't do as much as I wanted, and I definitely need to be a bit more brave with that in the future. That's a good way to start, but I think oil paints are definitely more suited for the streaking effects. Next, we're going to use some black paint to add some shadows around different parts to either emphasize them or actually just reinforce that they are shadowed. So here I wanted to emphasize the gun barrel a little bit. Here that actually should be shadowed and darker. And then obviously on the bottom of the armor plate here, you definitely want some shadow. The problem with enamel paint is that it blends all or nothing, as I said before. So you really don't get a nice blended look at the end. It looks very stark. Next, we're going to do oil dot modulation. And as you can see, these are actually custom mixes that I made just for this model, with a little bit of white, black, some blue, and then some browns as well to warm it up a little bit. And I mixed it in 3 different shades, some with more white, some with more black, just to get the full range of modulation there. And the main thing you want to do is focus the lightest colors around the top and the darkest around the bottom. So as you can see on the front plate there, lightest colors at the top, and then I'll continue down with darker colors. So this is actually probably a better example. Light, there's the medium tone in random spots, and I'm going to do it over here as well, just to keep it wet on the brush. And then you can see that I'm adding the darker in. And you don't want to add as much dark as you do light or the medium tone, because it's just going to oversaturate and make it look really, really dark, or not oversaturate, make it look really dark and not very interesting. And then I'm just going to blend everything with a brush that's not dry. Artist oil paints are not going to blend dry. So you need a tiny bit of mineral spirits on there, but not that much. And then for this tank, I actually just stippled. I didn't actually streak much. I wish I had, but I think I'm going to add that later. So you can see here I tried a little bit of streaking, but I didn't like how it looked, so I came back and stippled over it afterwards. You want to make sure to focus the color change around the outside of each panel. So the center is the most accurate to the original color, and then moving out, you'll get a slightly darker or warmer color. And now you can see I'm going to repeat the process on the engine deck. As I was doing before, I'm going to start with the lightest color and work my way to the darkest. For this one, I wanted to focus lightest color around the center of the panel and then darkest around the edges. I feel like this is a pretty good strategy, and for any vertical or inclined surfaces, make sure darkest is at the bottom and lightest is at the top. The reason that you want to have the lightest around the center is because it emphasizes the edges of the panel afterwards. Because that's lighter and the outside is darker, it makes a very defined panel. And now we're going to move on to tools. So because the whole tank is gray, I didn't want to paint the tools gray. So I decided to make a kind of rusty, still kind of gray paint from light rust, dark gray, and then of course drying retarder. And I feel like this made actually a pretty decent effect of rusted metal. Now this is going to be reinforced later with different oil paints, but we'll get to that. Always make sure that you have AK interactive drying retarder on hand. It makes brush painting a total dream. If you've been painting without it and you get it, you will notice the difference immediately. It spreads more evenly, more easily, the coverage is just perfect, and of course it makes it dry nice and slowly so you can work with your paint mixture for a very long time, enough time for you to do whatever you need to do with it. After all the metal parts are painted, I'm just going to go through and color each other small part that I thought needed a different color. So for the handles of the wire cutters, obviously they're going to be reddish brown because they were compressed paper that was dyed red. For the starter crank, I just thought that chocolate brown worked. For the end of the end of the cleaning rod here, I thought that Iraqi sand would be a nice canvas color, a nice faded look, and I think it actually did turn out okay. After that, we're going to take some burnt umber oil paint, and it's super thin, and just brush it over each metal part. And once this dries, it looks like the whole part has just rusted and been on the tank forever, and helps tell the story of this just I don't know, rugged beast that survived the battle and come out on top. And I think it just helps make the tank more interesting. Now, the ends of the tool clamp handles were plastic, and so, or a very early form of plastic, and so I thought that the chocolate brown actually matched it pretty well. Then, to simulate paper that had, been torn up and the original colors showing through, I just covered these in a super, super diluted mix of Iraqi sand. After that, we can start working on the whitewash. Now, the whitewash, it always looks better if you model it, and that's MOTTLE. Because it just adds so much interest and variance, like they put on multiple coats. So I'm just going to take some titanium white oil paint. I know you can use, it's either MIG ammo or AK Interactive washable white paint, but I find that oil paint works just as well. It might not for another supplier of oil paint, but I find that Master Touch is actually pretty decent at what it does, for me at least. Then we're just going to start stippling with the brush. For here, I wanted to make some streaks. For over in different places, you're just going to add it and then stipple it with almost a fully dry brush. You want just the faintest trace to be left. Then, of course, we want to add some streaks. So you'll paint vertical lines. They don't actually have to be perfectly vertical. And then after that, you'll come in with a mineral spirits soaked brush and refine those streaks. It's just like normal streaking, just with white. And I think it really helps sell the idea that this is some old, worn down whitewash. Because this paint never really stayed on that long, it was either thinned down chalk or some really thin paint that they applied with a broom. If they could, they would get an air gun, but generally it would be super messy and gross. So I'm just trying to recreate that modeled appearance that a broom and random application would make. And then of course the chalk is water soluble, so it would streak a lot, which I think really makes it look good here. The secret to good streaking is to work from the bottom and the top. So as you can see, I flipped the model over and I'm refining the streaks in this direction after working on them right side up. And this really helps them to be vertical and even looking. Also remember, you never need to overdo it with streaks, otherwise they're going to look bad. So once it's 80%, just stop, and you're going to find that once it dries, it actually looks really good. Streaks are never vertical, so don't sweat it too much, but it does help a lot if they are vertical when you're done. It helps the looks a lot. I like mine tapering off to a sharp point. This is just my preference, but I feel like it looks much more natural this way. Some people like to have an even streak all the way up, but it looks a little too fake for me. It looks like you did it with acrylics or something, and it wasn't refined. It was just splashed on and done. So, in my opinion, a vertical, pointy streak always looks good. As you can see here from the kind of bad footage, sorry it's flashing a little bit, I'm cleaning away the oil paint from around the decal because I don't think they would have painted over it. Now, I haven't looked at enough pictures to be 100% sure, but I feel like they would have wanted to be able to identify their vehicle and so wouldn't have painted over it. As you can see on the back plate here, you really want to go for a white and then kind of a gray white undertone underneath it. So you want patches of super white color and then some that is just toned down and it looks older. So it looks like multiple layers and adds a lot of interest that way. And there's the finished result. I think that the streaking and oil paints really helped integrate the whitewash with the rest of the model, and it looks pretty natural now. Beforehand it was pretty stark. But you can see that the subtle streaking on the front really helps it look old, and the modeling effect also adds to that. Make sure that to check it afterwards because oil paints can leave a little bit of texture that you don't want. Now that the whitewash is done, I'm going to start chipping the model. Now to start off, I'm going to use the sponge chipping technique with a piece of ragged sponge that I've torn bits off so it's uneven, and then some Vallejo gray paint. I actually did too much paint on the sponge this time and it looks way overdone and there's way too much, but that's something for the future. Always make sure that there's very little paint on the sponge or else it's going to look bad no matter what. It might be quicker, but trust me, taking your time and doing it well is well worth the results. Now we're going to refine some of the details with a fine pointed brush. And in this case, I'm just going to outline some of the panels that I thought would be chipped. And again, this is way overdone and I really need to redo it and do better on my next model. Now, a toothpick really helps refine chips and make them jagged. This is something you should always do on every model because it's never going to look perfect. After that, we're going to use some dark brown gray color and fill in all the chips. Make sure that the border of light gray around the dark brown color is actually pretty large because that's going to look most accurate. And I wouldn't say fill all of the chips in, but what I've found is that making a bunch of smaller chips definitely sells it better than making a couple large ones and no super tiny ones. Again, I really feel like I messed up with the chipping on this model, but I did okay around the hatches here. You can see that I'm doing very small fine chips and outlining the parts very lightly. You don't want to do super consistent outlines with the gray. If you do, it looks too stark and unrealistic. So make sure to have tons of tiny little specks and your chipping should look pretty good. I've practiced since and the next model's not going to be anything like this, I promise. And after that, the all-powerful toothpick came back out to clean up the mess I'd made on the back panels. Now, if anything saved this chipping job, the rust definitely did. This is my own custom mixture that I made from burnt umber oil paints, light rust, enamel paints, and a ton of thinner. And I'm just going to apply it over any majorly chipped area. that would have rusted up, and basically rust is irreversible and extremely hard to clean up, and so I don't think it's actually that unrealistic to put a bunch of rust on your model. Now, of course, it's not going to be streaking or anything like that, but a little bit of feathered rust around the edges of some chips is definitely realistic, because I doubt that the Germans had the time to scrape off built up rust. Trust me, I've done it on machine tools and it's really hard. But honestly, cleanup and application for the rust is probably the easiest part of this whole process. All you have to do is put it in places that logically make sense that there would be rust, and then just feather out the areas that you put it in with a brush. Make sure not to take it all off, because that's super easy to do, but trust me, the rust will make it look a million times better. And last, but definitely not least, we're going to do some metal effects on the idler wheels. Now I'm going to start with some Vallejo silver color. And this is actually the Vallejo Model Air metallic colors, and they actually brush really, really nicely. This is unthinned. There's nothing that I did to it. I actually just brushed it on from the bottle. And as you can see, it already looks really good. But we can make it look so much better with some upcoming effects. After that, I'm going to rub the whole wheel, or the contact point at least, with a graphite stick. And all the graphite stick is doing is depositing large amounts of graphite onto the areas that I want it to be. The graphite stick does not polish the wheel, it just deposits graphite, because it's actually just leaving large clumps, and it doesn't look good unless you go back and polish it with a silicone brush. And now you'll start to see some fantastic results. I'm taking my silicone brush and just rubbing the wheels, like as much and as hard as I can. I mean, well, probably not as hard, but you want constant force on the wheels, because that's going to rub the pigment into the paint and inundate it in the paint, so it's not going to ever come out, and it's going to look very natural. But as you can see, the shine and the consistency is just perfect. And with that, we're done. Sorry that the video release schedule has been so sporadic, but I'm going to make some changes after this season that'll ensure more consistent content. Big thank you to Panzermeister36 for doing this collaboration with me, and a massive thank you to Samuel Fisher for joining my Patreon. If you want to join him in supporting me, you'll get awesome perks like frequent workbench updates, a hotline to me, Scale Studio, as well as my undying gratitude and respect. Also, don't forget to vote in our next model poll, link in the description below. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please smash that like button and subscribe for more like it. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.